So we can get started here. So thanks everyone that is joining the webinar. We're going to cover the topic of expansion acquisition financing, and more specifically, how you can use the SBA 7A loan program to do an add-on acquisition with SBA financing and everything that allows for. So just to kind of get started here, so Rafael, who is our head of business development at Pioneer Capital Advisory, I'll let him just give a quick background on us before we get started.
Yes, absolutely. So Pioneer Capital, we are a commercial loan brokerage. We are focused on helping business buyers navigate the SBA financing process. We like to be very hands-on and really support our clients from start to finish. From the moment you have a pre-LOI, we can do letters of support, we can do deals reviews, to the moments that you are able to get a deal under LOI, and then we can guide you through the financing journey. We were founded in 2022. We just hit the mark of $300 million in SBA closed deals. So super exciting. We've been growing a lot. We are excited in what we have ahead of us. And I mean, Matthias, if you want, I can continue explaining more about the process, or I can leave it to a little bit.
Yeah, so maybe we'll leave the process kind of further along. So just to dive in here, so Tristan, who's joining us, is a former client of Pioneer. So we've had the fortunate opportunity to work with him twice. Once when he bought one of his companies, and then at the second time when he did an add-on acquisition and then refinanced the SBA debt from his current company. Tristan, would you want to just give a quick background on yourself and what you do?
Yeah, for sure. And thanks for having me today. But yeah, as it notes here on the slide, I'm a partner and founder in Aragon Holdings, and the big initiative there is the focus that we have around acquiring and operating marketing agencies between really the $500,000 to $3 million annual revenue range. And within that range, we've done, like Matthias mentioned, a couple of SBA transactions within the last 2.5, 3 years. And as it mentions here, I've been operating agencies for a long time, so I've also been on the exit side as well. My first agency that I created, I exited about 15 years ago. So I've been on both sides of the table. I've used SBA financing for 2 out of the 3 deals we've done in the last few years, and excited to share some of those experiences today.
Tristan, and one question for you that I think might be of value for the listeners. So lots of people get into acquisitions from different walks of life. Before you became a business owner, what was your background before getting into the marketing agency space?
Yeah, as most agency owners are, they kind of fall into being, it's like an accidental agency owner almost. And before I started my first agency, which was a video production company, I was a consultant at some of the large software companies I'm sure folks know about, Oracle and IBM. And I was doing a lot of government-wide ERP implementations at the time. And what really drove me towards being an agency owner was just a big shift a long time ago to something called YouTube, where a lot of companies were putting video on the web. So I'm dating myself there a little bit, Matthias, but
right.
That is where I got my start. So from there, it just kind of grew into other capabilities and services. Just tried to continue to listen to clients and what they were looking for, and kind of fallen into a situation where we're mostly working with tech companies right now. So that's my background, my business partner's background. We're very familiar with technology and how to market technology, and that's really where we've evolved to really just more full service around helping small, scrappy marketing teams at tech companies run their marketing.
Got it. No, thanks for sharing all that, Tristan. It's every single person that we've worked with, they come from a different background, and there's no perfect background to get into acquisition entrepreneurship. So I think it's helpful for anyone that's on here. So just to kind of get started, to kind of kick things off with a rundown of the agenda of what we're going to cover. So first, we're going to talk about what is an expansion acquisition within the framework of SBA lending. Then we're going to talk about the SBA guidelines. So these change periodically as the rules evolve. Tristan, if I recall correctly, I think the most recent SBA financing you closed on, the guidelines had changed since the initial one. So it's always an ever-evolving process, for better or for worse. Then we're going to talk about the down payment requirements with an SBA finance acquisition, go through a couple of mock-up case studies of how this works, and then Tristan's going to talk about his add-on acquisition from a high level, and then just different pitfalls and things to be cognizant of if you're a current business owner or acquisition entrepreneur planning to do an expansion acquisition, just to plan accordingly. So just to kind of kick things off here, so an expansion acquisition from a big picture standpoint, sorry for getting ahead of myself here, is basically when you as a current business owner are adding on or acquiring a business to your existing platform. So in Tristan's circumstance, having a marketing agency that he owns and currently operates, and then buying another one to essentially add on to it. And so with an expansion acquisition, there are benefits specific to the way the SBA lenders look at it. One is that you currently have experience running your current business. You're hopefully a proven operator. You know what you're talking about from an industry lingo perspective, margins, how the business should be run. Essentially, you've been in the trenches. And so from an underwriting perspective, you as a buyer check a lot of the experience factors that the banks really want to see. And so really the bank is looking at, one, how well have you run your current company? Is it financially profitable? What are margins? What has debt service coverage looked like, both since you've acquired the company and what you've done from a growth standpoint? And then two, with the company that you're buying, does it make sense from a story perspective to fold into your current business? And do you have the wherewithal, both operationally and financially, to be able to run both at once? And so essentially the lender wants to see, are these two companies really symbiotic where they're going to run well together? And really the combined value of both is greater than both of each individually. So going here to the next slide. So different types of expansion acquisitions. So one is what's called a horizontal acquisition. So basically, you as a borrower or as a business are buying a competitor that's in the same business in the same industry. And so basically, you're growing your market share and creating economies of scale. Then there's a vertical acquisition or vertical expansion acquisition, and that's you as a business buyer essentially acquiring a supplier or a customer in your value chain. So think, for example, here, let's say you're a property management company or you own a bunch of self-storages and you're looking to basically one of the items on your P&L statement, you want to basically own that so that that's not money going out the door to a vendor, but that's something going to yourself. You could look at, what are the big ticket items on your P&L statement and seeing essentially, could that make sense to acquire? For this webinar, that's not going to be the route that we're going to kind of go down here. Another kind of aspect is geography. So buying a business in a similar market or territory. And one of the things that recently changed with the SBA guidelines is to qualify as an expansion acquisition, you no longer have to check that requirement for geographical territory. So that used to be something under the old guidelines before they most recently changed. So moving on to the next kind of thing here, it's talking about the SBA guidelines from a high level. So before 2023, And the SBA standard operating procedure 5010-6 and before that, there was no clear definition of what a business expansion was. And so one thing that we saw at Pioneer was banks were really kind of taking their own interpretation as to how they wanted to qualify these. And generally speaking, banks, just being conservative in nature, even SBA banks, they don't like uncertainty and they don't like to operate in the gray area because they take on the risk that if a loan file gets audited or goes into default, that it's not going to check the boxes for them to get paid back by the SBA. And so before 2023, expansion acquisitions, while they took place, they weren't happening at the same rate that they are now, that there's specific granular clarity. And so bank kind of lender interpretation varied. That was kind of one thing that I saw at Pioneer in visiting with these deals and clients. Some banks would do them, others weren't so keen on them. And then the other thing was, even though within the way some of the banks were looking at them, there wasn't the stipulation on the 10% down, since it was very ambiguous on the wording. Lots of banks wanted to see cash equity into the deal. And so essentially the long and short is before 2023, there was just inconsistency on how different lenders were interpreting these, making them harder to get done and just fewer options from a lending and financing perspective. So back in 2023, when the guidelines came out in the fall of 2023, they basically gave specificity that if you were buying a company in the same 6-digit industry code with identical ownership, that business could qualify as an expansion acquisition if it was in the same geographic area. Now, some banks looked at same geographic area as same state. Others looked at it, from what I recall, as kind of similar markets. So, a couple hours driving distance. But essentially that ambiguity kind of still being there gave some banks kind of the unease as to, is the add-on really in close enough proximity to the existing platform, or is it too far away? So fast forward to last June, essentially kind of what happened was the guidelines stayed the same on industry code, ownership, and having the add-on acquisition be the co-borrower, but they clarified the reasonable distance and basically kind of looked at it from, if someone like a Tristan or Rafael was doing an add-on, if you could get to the company you're buying and back in a day drive or flight, but typically drive, that checked the requisite box. So fast forward a couple months later to September of last year, and all of a sudden, the geographic requirement went away. And so this fundamentally is a game changer for a couple of reasons. One is, if you're looking to buy across state lines, that really kind of opens the aperture. And then companies like agencies, for example, take Tristan's that don't necessarily have a physical footprint to them. That gives more flexibility to banks and how they think about underwriting the add-on acquisitions. So essentially this is kind of the sequencing of the documentation that took place, kind of correlating back to the prior slide. So fall 2023, SBA SOP 5010 7.1, that was when the clarification as to what an expansion acquisition looks like first came into place. June was when it changed to basically give the clarity on the geographic area. And then that went away in September of 2025. So these are basically some of the requisites now under the current SBA guidelines as of today that you as a business owner need to check if you want to avoid bringing any cash to close. So one is same 6-digit NAICS code. That's typically on the top of the business tax return. The second is the ownership has to be identical. So if you're planning to bring in an investor or new person to the ownership group, that all of a sudden adds the requirement for the 10% down. And then the third thing is your current company needs to be a co-borrower with the business that you're acquiring. So here are just a couple of, to memorialize that last slide, things that could disqualify you if you're trying to do an add-on acquisition. One is the industry code is different, and you validate that with the business tax returns, making sure that it matches on your current business with the one that you're acquiring. Two is if you don't want your current business to be a co-borrower, it's just not going to work, unfortunately. Third is the banks really want to see at least 2 years of operating activity. And so if the company you're buying is too nascent, it's going to be classified as a new business and not existing company. Fourth is different ownership. You have to keep the ownership groups the same. If you're doing a deal for the first time, first acquisition, it would not be treated as an expansion acquisition. And so you'd have to bring 10% down. And then if you're trying to buy part of a company but not all of it, it's going to be a partial change of ownership, not an expansion acquisition. So just kind of moving forward here, talking about deal structuring. So expansion.
And maybe, sorry, Matthias,
Yes, sir.
just to clarify to everyone, is it still possible to buy business with different ownerships and everything? The main thing here is how you're going to be classified for the SBA. If you want to be classified as a business expansion and has 0% down payment, then you need to respect those three things. As Matthias mentioned, if you you're already own a business and buying a second one, but it will have a different ownership or it's a partial buyout, then of course you can buy that business, but it's going to be kind of like as a new acquisition and the minimum 10% will be required. But is it still eligible to pursue that acquisition?
Yep. Yeah. So thanks for that, Rafael. So this, just to clarify, is if you want to do the 0% down, these are the boxes you'd have to check. So just to kind of give some additional clarity here, with an expansion acquisition, taking the example of, if you're buying a $3 million business inclusive of purchase price plus other deal costs, so working capital, SBA fees, et cetera, you could potentially finance the entire thing and did not have to put any money down. A lot of times people will still opt to have a seller's note that's discretionary based on your preferences in the bank. Now, if you're doing a first-time acquisition, that same $3 million loan budget, you can only get financing up to $2.7 million, which is 90% of the total use of funds. And basically, you would have to bring at least $150,000 of cash if the seller was doing a seller's note on full standby for the other $150,000. So now we're going to just give a couple of examples here. So these are just kind of anonymized examples, not former clients, just for kind of really illustrating how this works in practicality. So this would be the example of, let's say you're trying to do an expansion acquisition in the accounting CPA space, and you have a current business in Columbus, Ohio. I'm not a fan of Ohio State. I'm a Wisconsin Badgers fan, but anyone that's on here from Ohio, take no shade from that. Essentially, you would basically, if it's in the same 6-digit NAICS code, the same ownership for this add-on acquisition, which is in Westerfield, and you're willing to have both companies as co-borrowers, you can avoid doing any down payment whatsoever, and you could finance the entire thing. Generally speaking, it's nice to have a seller's note, but that's purely discretionary. Now, if you're doing this as a change of ownership, that's what COO stands for here, you could only get financing up to 90% of that. If the seller is willing to hold a seller's note on 10-year standby, you could put down half of the 10% as cash, and then their seller's full standby note could count for the other half of the down payment. And so basically in this scenario, you could create synergies between these two companies but by doing this. And if the numbers work, essentially, it's something that most SBA banks would entertain. We've done deals similar in profile to this one before. Not specifically an add-on in the accounting space, but others kind of comparable to this in the trade space. Now, here's an example kind of very similar in nature to the former one, where with the current SBA guidelines and the removal of the geographic requirement, this one is in different states in the Southeast. So one is in Georgia, the other is in Tennessee. And so the current company, Atlanta-based Georgia commercial landscaping firm, and the target company is one in Nashville, Tennessee. Now, why would someone do this? I don't specifically know based on this earnings profile, but it's something that you could do. So if you wanted to do an acquisition like this one, and it made sense from a management standpoint, an oversight standpoint, and a financial standpoint, you could basically now buy across state lines through the current SBA guidelines. And so in this scenario, these two companies are 250 miles apart. This is one where, even though it checks the SBA's requirement, there would probably need to be some socialization with lenders, which is where we would get involved to help to see if this makes sense to really kind of suss out the finer details. But since both of the industry codes match, the ownership percentages are the same here between Maria and Carlos, and both companies are co-borrowers. This is something that now could get done that couldn't before September of last year. So now we're going to jump to our friend Tristan, and Tristan's going to kind of talk a little bit about his initial acquisition and the platform New North, and then what he was able to accomplish through subsequent M&A. And Tristan, I'll let you go into as much detail as you're comfortable with here.
Yeah, for sure. And I think so. This one's a good one to start with. This was the first acquisition that we did as part of really expanding Motion at the time, which was a video podcast agency. So I'm thinking, Matthias, when we had operated Motion for about 5 to 6 years before we started to explore acquisitions. And, as an agency owner, a really good year is 10 to 15, maybe even 20% growth. And so from a growth perspective, we started to look at inorganic growth. How can we grow through acquisitions and really add to our existing platform using one of those dimensions that you talked about, whether it was expanding geography, moving into a different vertical, perhaps looking at a competitor. And so we initially, as Motion was a video podcast agency at the time, our initial search involved trying to acquire a competitor at that point. So that's what we were mostly vetting right away. About a couple months into the process, we ran across New North, which was, it wasn't even officially on the market yet. They hadn't even put together a SIM or anything. We had a good conversation in place with the owner. And this actually allowed us to really expand our capabilities. So that was another one of those buckets that you talked about from an expansion standpoint. We were able to move from a video podcast agency to broaden out the services that we were offering to the same exact ideal customer profile. So both companies were predominantly working with B2B organizations that had a focus in technology. We were able to expand beyond content into account-based marketing, also paid programs, and really help our clients in a greater capacity than what we could, just with Motion as it was at the time. And so this acquisition process allowed us to really explore SBA financing as the primary vehicle to do that. And Matthias, I don't know if you remember, but before we even had the LOI on this transaction, there was another one that we were doing outside of an expansion loan. I don't know if you even remember that. This was like early days.
Yeah, this was like 23 or like
yeah, and we were looking at acquiring a bookkeeping firm that would work with agencies, and so we were going to try to take something that was on the expense side of our P&L, like you talked about, and we were going to acquire like that financial capability, and that would give us, really a wedge into finding other agencies that we could help, bring on board and acquire from that standpoint. That didn't work out mostly because it wasn't in our NAICS code, and it wasn't an expansion loan. And that's really when I learned about the difference between, having that 10% down, having that capital or equity injection, a part of it, versus if we did expand, what did that look like? And for our first acquisition, really as part of this venture, is really appealing to go in that direction, find a business that was much more familiar to us. We understood how the agency operated. It was very closely aligned with a lot of the resources that we had internally at the time. There's a lot of just synergy there, which is what you're looking for probably with your first acquisition, that naturally de-risks a lot of it if you're not venturing into a completely new territory like bookkeeping, like we would have been. And so we had a lot of those conversations during that time, and we actually worked with you to obviously get this in place after we had this LOI signed, and we went through the acquisition process, and we did use, like you have here, a process that involved SBA 7A loan. We had some other components to the deal that I can go into, but hopefully that gives some high level view into the transaction. The big piece that you do have here as a bullet item is there was $0 out of pocket for that transaction, which was in contrast to the first deal that we looked at on the bookkeeping side.
Super helpful, Tristan. I think a couple of other things that might be helpful. So back to like getting the story straight with the bank that lends on the add-on to get them comfortable with it, especially doing the 0% down. What went into explaining kind of the current business and, essentially that it was dialed in a good spot from an ops and oversight standpoint, where doing the add-on wouldn't stretch you too thin from like a time perspective? How did you go about kind of conveying that?
Yeah, it's a good point. The one thing that had us moving in the direction of acquisition as a growth, initiative was because me and my business partner had a lot of time available with our current business. We had very efficient operations. We had both owners involved, but really we were both trying to figure out what's next for us. So there was a lot of time in our day, and we were actually looking to find a role for us and find another agency that we could take over, perhaps sales or some other leadership capacity where that founder or owner was looking to exit out of their role. And so it's trying to find that. It's really just trying to put a puzzle piece together. Like, how can we find an owner or founder that's looking to move on, perhaps exit the business fully, which was a requirement then, and let's analyze what that person is doing, and can we fill that gap with our current workload? The capacity that we have remaining, can we take over that role and then expand without stretching ourselves too thin? And that became a part of a lot of the conversations we were having, because we had conversations with you, Matthias, and some other folks just on the financing side to figure out what is a good combination there. What is a good story, and then what is the model moving forward for us? What does it look like when we do bring on another agency? And at the time, the agency that we acquired was larger from a revenue perspective than what we were at the time. So we not only were acquiring someone of equal size from a revenue standpoint, but the team was actually larger than what we had. So it's not typically my recommendation to do your first acquisitions, take on a larger team, but it was a good fit because we had the ability to take over some of those responsibilities from the founder and really just have everything mesh together really well.
Another question, Tristan. So the lender that financed the second deal was a different lender than the one that financed the first deal. And with getting the co-borrowers kind of in place where the same bank would have both entities as the co-borrowers, walk through kind of pulling in the existing platform for the refinance and kind of how the bank that did the add-on acquisition looked at that or wanting to have the first lien on that company.
Yeah, so that was part of the we originally just were going to do a separate loan for the last deal that we did, but then we ended up factoring in the initial SBA loan as part of the refinance. And Matthias, that's something I didn't even know. That wasn't even really on my radar, actually. I didn't know the possibilities there until we started having some of those conversations. I have to kind of give credit to you for exploring that a little further. Um, but yeah, as far as bringing in that first loan, it was a good fit because once again, it was all part of really the same story. We were expanding. Um, we had created marketers in demand, which was really that operating holding company that was allowed to hold everything together, which wasn't even in place when we did the first transaction. Motion actually had acquired New North, and this last time we had marketers in demand set up in place so that we could really have that cohesive nature across all the agencies. So we were able to demonstrate growth in that area, that we had the ability to operate a platform, consolidate resources, smooth things out from an operational standpoint. And that was all part of those conversations that we did have with the bank.
Got it. No, super helpful. Let me just see what the next slide is here.
Can I ask a question? Not
Yeah.
so on the financing side, Tristan, but if anyone is here like listening and planning to acquire a business to expand, maybe a piece of advice on how they can do that merge as successful as possible, because you were combining two different teams, two different cultures, two different operation systems. How did you manage that in the post acquisition? And if you have any advice for a buyer that is contemplating an expansion through acquisition.
One adjacent question to that, Tristan, not to
Mhm.
pile too much on you here, is from a branding standpoint, and did you keep both brands or labels separate, or did you change
Yeah.
them?
Yeah, great questions, and I think they're kind of intertwined. Rafael, to your point, like what do we do from a culture standpoint? I underestimated how important culture was, quite honestly. It was interesting because me and my business partner at Motion, we had a global team in place. We were remote, and we had actually shifted before we started looking at acquisitions. We changed our business dramatically. Before COVID, we were operating heavily on a local, tight geographic basis. We were a video production company. We were filming on site. So naturally, you're only going to film on site based on how far you can drive to and from the location. And a lot of your clients reside within that close proximity. And when we just realized that we needed to change our business if we wanted to grow, and we were kind of restricting the type of talent that we could bring on. And, we were really only be able to hire folks within like a 10-15 mile radius from the downtown office we had. So we actually, it was quite lucky in a way that we were able to get out of our large lease. We had a commercial lease involved, and we did all that before COVID hit. And so we had the opportunity to convert to a fully remote agency before the pandemic came along. So we were well prepared once that did occur. And so our culture had shifted from kind of this in-office culture to a remote global environment. And when we acquired New North, it was a local agency. They did have an office, and we underestimated how much or how difficult that would be. And it wasn't easy. I'll be honest. It's something that we do factor in now is trying to figure out if there is a remote culture in place. How's work get done from an agency perspective? What kind of project management systems are in place? What does internal communication look like? What does an accountability structure look like? So we've really refined how we analyze agencies before they become part of our consideration set. So culture is something that I underestimated. It's very important, and all I could say is, Rafael, it's not easy. We've really just added pieces to our process along the way, just from things that we've learned. And we also have advisors that we bring on now, and it helps. You just get a lot of different perspectives, people who've done this before, and you start to just package up a lot of different tools and techniques to help that along the way. Because I don't, even if your culture is very much aligned, there are always going to be things that are surprises or different, post close. It just, that's really the only thing I can say to folks is, you may think through due diligence you've uncovered everything, but there will be things that you didn't catch, or you didn't see beforehand.
That's such a good point, Tristan. I think, counterintuitive viewpoint here on business ownership. I think the sales and marketing part is like the one of the easier parts, in the culture and like connecting with everyone and the team and all of that. That can be the harder part. And like, I think a lot of people that come from the finance backgrounds, consulting and banking and similar, they miss on that, and they're just looking at everything through a model, and it's more challenging than you'd think to run a company.
100%. Yeah, you have your spreadsheet in place. You prepare your model for the bank, and you have your projections in there. But we all know that whatever is on that spreadsheet, whenever you project, is largely based on assumption, and there's a lot of variability to that post close. And I think that's one thing, though, Matthias, to your point, you have to be prepared for that. You almost have to build in some of those assumptions around variability. It's going to cost more in some of those early months than maybe what you estimated, and you just have to be prepared for that. That's why working capital is a big piece, which we might get into. But back to your question, Matthias, on brand, our our whole strategy so far with Markers in Demand is to, when we do acquire an agency, we keep the front door the same. So the agency still exists, still has their own website, but it becomes, a Marketers in Demand company. So it gets tied, there's an affiliation with the operating company that we have. And the reason we do that is, there's still a lot of equity with the agencies we buy. There's a lot of word of mouth. These agencies have been around for over 10, 15 years. People still know of them through their different networks, the previous owners. So we want to maintain a lot of that moving forward. So that's what we've done so far. We have like morphed some of the brands. We tried to make it consistent, and we're always working on that, but that's been the approach so far.
Super helpful. One question in the Q&A before moving on to the next slide, Tristan, is what are your thoughts about profit share agreements with select clients of the podcasting agency? And does it make sense to make acquisitions in certain client niches, considering their ability to increase sales?
So walk me through that. Like if it's from like the first agency perspective, Matthias, what's the...
Yeah, so here's, and Durrell, feel free to kind of add any clarity here. So the question is, what are Tristan's thoughts about profit share agreements with select clients of the podcasting agency? Does it make sense to make acquisitions in certain client niches, considering their ability to increase sales? So I guess clients of your current agencies, and then doing subsequent M&A.
Oh, like performance, almost like performance or profit sharing based on some of the collaborations you do.
But buying or partnering with clients, TLDR.
Yeah, it's interesting. We haven't explored that. We've acquired podcasts before where they were a client of ours, and they were going to shut down the podcast, and we bought it and we use it for our own marketing purposes. So we have done that. We have done some sponsorship, like deals where we would do profit sharing based on some of the work that we're doing. We've explored some of it. We just found it's not really as scalable or as sustainable. It is really just providing the service and helping folks grow and just getting better at what we're good at already. So that's kind of my initial take there.
Got it. No, super helpful. So moving on, or Rafael, you want to say something, it looks like?
I know there is actually another interesting question here in the Q&A from Steve. If I close on a platform business acquisition today, assuming I find an expansion business tomorrow that checks the SBA guidelines from the previous slides, could I execute on that quickly? And that's interesting because the seasoning from one acquisition to the other is something that is worth to explain. And Matthias, I know that you probably will be able to even bring more
Yeah.
clarity on that. Typically, lenders like to see some space between acquisitions. Of course, it really depends. If we are talking about an acquisition that it's in a direct industry, sometimes we can try to push for something right after one acquisition right after the other. I will probably recommend going to the same lender just because you're very early on in the first acquisition process. They will probably be the one more comfortable giving you another loan sitting behind the first loan. But if we are talking about a typical window in between acquisitions, I would say a year, 18 months is probably what makes most of the lenders comfortable with that scenario. But Matthias, feel free to also add a different perspective.
Yeah, no, great thoughts, Rafael. Steve, what I've seen, the minimum that I've seen lenders get comfortable is 2 like full financial quarters. And basically they want to see that, between the time you've bought the current company, you've been able to grow it or kind of keep it at steady state and things are going well. If it's kind of in closer proximity than that, it gets super challenging because the bank looks at like you're trying to do too much too soon. Back to Raphael's comment, it's a lot easier if you can get the initial bank that you do the first acquisition with behind your thesis and plan. Because back to Tristan, for example, where it was a second bank that did the subsequent deal instead of the initial bank, if you have to pull in another SBA lender to do deal number 2, generally speaking, they're going to want to take a first lien on your current company, not a second lien, since a second lien isn't really worth anything in a liquidation scenario. And they're going to want to refinance out your current SBA loan. And then you're going to have to pay a guarantee fee on that refi, which is going to be more than if you just kept that loan standalone. And so what I would say, candidly, Steve, is minimum 2 financial quarters is what I've seen, and plan to have the initial platform company be one that you have a GM or like a person with ops chops in place that you can basically convey that they're strong enough to really kind of row the boat in the current platform while you focus on the second deal. Because otherwise it just looks to the bank like you're trying to do too much too quickly. That's what I've seen.
Yeah. But can I add something as well, Matthias?
Sure.
If you think that's going to be the case and that you're like, you have a deal under LOI and you think you're going to be a second one in the same industry, maybe considering acquiring both together. Not like, again, these can be challenging, but in this scenario, by presenting both opportunity together with a really strong business plan on how you're going to operate both of those locations. And of course, you're going to have, a personal financial statement that can support both acquisitions. I think that's for a very close proximity will be the best chances that you have in acquiring both business by presenting them together to the same lender.
Yeah, counterintuitively, from what we've seen at least, is if you have 2 companies in the same market that you're trying to buy together, and at least one of them has a GM or ops person, it's easier to package them together and do both in tandem than to stagger them because you have less uncertainty. Now, some banks just can't get behind the 2 for 1 or 2 deals at one, but we've done it before.
Yeah.
So moving on to the next slide here, Tristan, I don't know if there's anything on here that you'd want to cover. This was just some kind of dialogue on the deal structure for the platform.
Yeah, I think we've talked through a lot of this, like as far as why we went in that direction, and it was really expanding our capabilities, and going beyond that. There, like you have here on this slide, it was $0 down. We have same NAICS code, marketing services. So the another thing that strengthened this, Matthias, was, at least from my opinion, the customer overlapped quite a bit across all agencies as well. So it's not like we were acquiring an agency that did marketing for landscaping services, and then over here we had an agency focused on tech companies. It was largely overlapped across the board. And that was a big piece I felt of the story as well, and just how familiar we were with the services and the resources internally.
And it also really helps to when things are going well from a financial perspective for the company that you acquired, because that really helps to get the banks comfortable, because you can then show that not only have you kept the current business at steady state, you've grown the existing company through, like, since you've bought it, and it helps kind of de-risk some of their uncertainty as to how well you're going to do when you buy again, since you've basically proven that as an operator.
Yeah, there was a. Oh, sorry, I was going to
Sorry.
say there was another thing we did too in between. So we had acquired after New North. We did another deal that was that didn't involve bank financing. Largely seller financing and cash, and it was a smaller deal. But we'd also just like packaged that story up as well, where we've done two transactions and have grown the business overall, and so that became part of the underlying theme when we went with the most recent lender.
Yep. So let's see here what's left. Okay, so some takeaways that I can pull together here, Tristan. So the platform deal is very important. So if you get the platform company wrong, it's super challenging to do subsequent M&A. And matching the business to your professional backgrounds, like in your case, kept coming from the consulting space and having transferable skills to running an agency, that helps a lot with conveying your story to the SBA banks and structuring the first deal in a way to prepare for subsequent M&A, whether that's, getting things right with the holding company, the ownership setup, the NAICS code thing, makes all the difference in the world when it comes to trying to do subsequent acquisitions. So like if the 6-digit industry code, if it's something that's super niche, where maybe the seller's CPA in the first deal has it wrong, getting that changed before you pursue the second deal can be really, really helpful, because that 6-digit NAICS code is going to ensure that you can do the 0% down on the second deal. And then, Kev, lastly here is, whether you're working directly with a bank or selfishly, Kev, self-servingly working with us, if you have the right person that you're working with, it makes a huge difference, because lots of banks typically can't promise that they can get behind the second deal unless they've seen it at the time they've seen the first deal. And so knowing that the bank that you're working with is one that can do add-on acquisitions at a certain point in time based on how the first deal is done really helps with making sure that you're set up with the right lending partner. And I think actually here, so a couple of other things just to be helpful if you're looking at doing on M&A is having all of the key financial components. So tax returns, financials, getting a quality of earnings report, something that we always recommend. Making sure that working capital is calibrated correctly, understanding revenue concentration. So lots of the time agencies have some clients that can end up being a big pocket of concentration. Tristan, from your perspective, how have you seen that come into play in reality?
Yeah, agency concentration is a big thing that we analyze, because you have to like go uh, a few layers to understand the customers too. Some of them are closely related or they're affiliates, and you really have to unpack that quite a bit, at least from a lot of the deals I've analyzed, and that does impact the enterprise value of agencies quite a bit. If you have, and I know lenders too are frankly looking at that as well. If you have any single entity that's over like 20%, that's going to be a certain red flag, and you need to balance that out with something in the structure of the deal somehow. You need to de-risk that. So yeah, it's a big thing with the agencies that we look at.
What do you say from your perspective if you were to kind of cherry pick, three things from this slide as the top most important things when you're evaluating a potential agency, if it makes sense to buy, or maybe it's a handful of things? What would you say?
Yeah, someone asked me about this, like after the first deal, what's something that I would change? And the quality of earnings, getting a third party QV done, I think is really important. And I would make that almost a requirement for anyone doing their first acquisition. I did not do that with the first one. I did it all myself. We're trying to be, um, as cost conscious as possible. But I feel like that's the wrong mindset. You're trying to de-risk yourself. You're trying to have a stable environment post close, and just having a third party do the review and to rebuild the financials to make sure that you understand exactly how cash is flowing in and out of a business is really important. It doesn't mean that you don't do your own QV, but it means that you had someone else also do another check and rebuild everything from actual bank statements. So I would think that would be number one for me. And then I think if you can really, like you have here, Matthias, you have your due diligence in major categories and you have a checklist, really getting that deal room locked down is important. Having everything organized and making sure that you're working with the seller to make sure that you have all this information. It's very tight because if you are doing SBA financing, it is a process. And we all know it. We need to work with folks like Pioneer to help that whole process. You're going to need to provide information to the bank, and then 30 days later you're going to have to provide it again. So you need to make sure that you always have the latest and greatest, and you're very well organized. So those are probably two big things. And you have a good list here, so you really need all of it A to Z.
And if I can add regarding Pioneer process, for those that are not familiar, that's exactly what we try to do, as Tristan mentioned. We have our own credit team, so we're gonna have a financial analyst responsible for your application. They're gonna review all the documents. You receive a document checklist right from the beginning with all the documents that we need to kick off your process. Once we are able to get some term sheet options, and once you sign the term sheet that you choose, you also gonna have support during underwriting and closing. We always have someone from our team that it's introduced to you right in the beginning, so we can really be one step ahead of time. We're gonna giving you a checklist of documents that we believe it's gonna be required, because that way we can really anticipate any problem, really organize your process, and avoid any unnecessary delays. That's why we are able to really help our clients to finalize and close their deal as fast and as efficient as possible.
Tristan, thanks for all that, Rafael. Tristan, one question in the Q&A here that I think may have come to play on one or both of your deals is thinking about key employees and retention plans for them. And back when you did your deals, if I recall correctly, I know that there were some questions about those. Could you just give like super macro level overview on how, like, what type of questions you got and what you did to de-risk things there?
Yeah, that's a great question. Because you have to look beyond the owner and founder and understand who are the key employees, especially, with SBA, the owners are typically moving out. They're going on to their next venture. So retention agreements are important. We did that with the New North deal that you see here. That was a key component to a lot of the conversations we had before the purchase agreement was signed. We wanted to know who the key players would be and how we could make sure that they were going to be intact moving forward. And that's important. I think any professional services company that you're looking at, that's a key component, right? You're not buying a product necessarily. You don't have inventory. It's not manufacturing, et cetera. That you're really trying to keep those relationships intact, and so you want to uncover, who those key players are before you do go to closing. And so, yeah, the retention agreements are important. And then the way to balance that is if on the flip side, you do have folks that exit is, do you have downside protection? You know, what kind of performance components can you put in place, which is interesting with SBA financing. And you know, we've done a lot of that work on the seller note side, you know, tying some of that to making sure that we do have performance in place. Otherwise, you know, seller notes, you know, don't receive the same amount. You know, the balance is different, et cetera. There's a lot of different ways to handle that, but that's what we've done so far.
Super helpful. Definitely appreciate you sharing all of that. So this slide here is just kind of a quick rundown of pitfalls with an expansion acquisition. So first is having the NACE code not matching the one for your current business. Second is overestimating synergies. So sometimes I've seen buyers that look at being able to shave off expenses on the company that they're buying by basically having synergies between the current one, whether that's bookkeeping or similar. And so really try to dial in there as much as possible. And Tristan, I'd be curious to get your perspective on that specifically. How do you think about synergies between companies and costs from a high level?
Yeah, a lot of when you're in the same NAICS code, obviously you're looking at redundancy from resources that you have. You know, maybe you have some folks on one side or the other that has a lot of capacity. And so by, you know, merging the operations together, you're able to, you know, fulfill that capacity without hiring any new people, or you may able to, you know, those resources just aren't required moving forward. And yet you need to put that into your model for sure. That becomes part of how you're able to comfortably service that debt post close. Because I think there's a model for the bank, right? That has, assuming expenses remain intact moving forward, but then also just as an owner operator, you want to probably add some more cushion as well, so that you can have, you know, some of that cash flow reserved for the unexpected things that arise. And so I think, you know, when I think about that synergy post close, you're just trying to model that out as much as possible beforehand. The one thing that we did do with our last acquisition, we put in a 90-day transition plan that was, you know, pretty detailed, and we worked with folks before the deal was done. That's not something we did with the New North transaction. It wasn't at the detail that we had this last time, and I think that's important to think about. You know, after you sign the deal, what happens that day? Like literally that day, what do you share with employees? How does that get disclosed, et cetera? Because until you have the purchase agreement signed, the deal might not happen. So there's only so much you can do beforehand. So you have to be ready to hit the ground running as soon as the pen hits the paper.
It's a big deal, honestly, to have that in place, whether you're doing an expansion acquisition or first acquisition, because there's, as the famous saying goes, there's no knowns and unknown unknowns, and the unknown unknown is what's going to happen after you buy the company. And so to the degree that you and the seller can work collaboratively on what that will look like, it goes leaps and bounds from what I've seen before. So lastly, I guess just to kind of wrap up here in the interest of time, and we'll make this slide deck available to everyone that signed up here for the webinar. So this is just kind of a sequencing of the different guideline changes going back to, well, this slide here kind of talks about the ones last fall on what the current state of the world looks like as of April of 2026. And these guidelines could change again this summer for all we know. On the current landscape. So you have to have the same 6-digit NAICS code or industry code. The ownership names and percentages have to be the same. And both your existing company and the one that you're buying have to be co-borrowers to do the $0 down. And as Rafael mentioned towards the middle of the webinar, this is only for an expansion acquisition. You don't have to check these boxes if you're doing a first acquisition. And this is the contact information for everyone here. Tristan is on LinkedIn. I didn't want to volunteer his email here on the webinar, but for anyone that wants to reach out to him, he's on LinkedIn. So And with that, we'll open up some
Nice.
Q&A for anyone that has questions. Tristan,
And also just, sorry, Matthias, go ahead.
yeah, Tristan, any words of wisdom as far as doing too much too soon with subsequent M&A?
Yeah, it's a good question. We wanted to try to move as quickly as possible. We did 3 in 2.5 years. We're trying to accelerate that. But I do think, at least from the SBA standpoint, Matthias, you're like 18-month time frame. I think is pretty 12 to 18 months is pretty accurate. That's about when we started to look into it. It felt like a comfortable range. It felt like the lenders were also favorable with that time frame as well. You're able to show performance and growth, and that was a good just timeline overall, I think.
If you were to go back and like knowing what you know now, and obviously there's been some changes with the SBA guidelines, is there anything from a structuring standpoint, whether it be holding company, NACE code, or anything else that you do differently?
The first transaction we did had all kinds of stuff, F reorgs, and it was a mess. I don't know if you remember that, Matthias, but structure something maybe I don't want to speak on too much because I'm always leaning on our legal reps for that. I mean,
Right.
we've had some good folks to lean on. There's so many different ways to structure deals and to use different entities to facilitate a transaction that it's almost a science, in and of itself. And so that is one area, quite frankly, I'm trying to learn. That's why we put Aragon Holdings in place. There's some things that we are doing in that area, and that's why we pulled in some advisors to help us with that. So it's probably one of the weakest areas, quite frankly.
Yeah. No, for sure. Candidly speaking, I honestly recommend to anyone that's on here is have a good attorney that helps with the corporate documentation setup. Now, obviously, there's, people are leaning on AI and similar, but there's the pattern recognition between having someone that's done lots of deals before and they've seen what's gone wrong, what's worked well. And candidly speaking, given the fact that you can finance that attorney fee into the SBA loan and count any payments you've made towards your legal, towards the down payment, there's no downside, candidly, other than the cost, of course, of having a good attorney. So,
yeah. And as Matthias mentioned, we're gonna be sending this deck later tonight or tomorrow morning, doing a follow-up. And I invite everyone that is interested to reach out to me. We can schedule a call, whether you're doing your first acquisition or an expansion through acquisition, or even a refinance. Those are all scenarios that we can help with, so we can review your bio profile, do a deal review, the letter of support, and of course guide you through the financing process once you have a deal in hand. So feel free to reach out and I'll be happy to connect. And thank you, Matthias, and thank you, Tristan, as well for setting
anyone that's
this up.
interested in exploring and working with us, Rafael on here is my point man. So Rafael at pioneercaps.com. He is a wealth of knowledge and can answer any and all questions on SBA financing. So, and for anything,
and when I don't know, I just ask Matthias. So
for anything he's not sure on it,
that's what I do. I just text Matthias when I have questions.
Awesome. All right. Thanks everyone for joining. Tristan, appreciate you. We'll make this webinar available for forever and a year. Take care.
Perfect. Thank you. Take care.
Everyone.
Bye.